What does it mean right now for you to be aware? To take in, the feeling of your body, the sounds around you, the fact that you're even having thoughts.
It feels completely fundamental, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But it opens up some of the most fascinating and really persistent questions we have. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going straight into, well, the deep end. The mysteries of consciousness, the self, and how we experience the world around us.
We've got a really interesting mix of ideas lined up. We're looking at thinkers like Kant and Aristotle, people grappling with this centuries ago,
Right.
but also bringing in perspectives from modern neuroscience and even some, perhaps unexpected corners like Eastern philosophy.
And our goal here for you listening is really to unpack these huge ideas, make them clear, engaging, hopefully maybe spark some new ways of thinking about your own experience.
Yeah, without getting totally overwhelmed, hopefully.
Okay, let's dive in then. At the heart of all this, there seem to be a couple of really fundamental puzzles.
Yeah.
First up, the mind-body problem. Are we just incredibly complex biological machines? Or is there something more? Something beyond the physical stuff?
And if there is something more, how on earth do they connect? How does the mental affect the physical and vice versa?
Exactly. And then the second big one, the problem of other minds.
Ah, yes.
You're listening to us now, and you almost certainly assume that we have inner experiences, thoughts, feelings, kind of like yours.
You probably extend that assumption to everyone you know.
Right. But what's the actual basis for that when you really push on it?
It's a surprisingly tricky question.
Okay, so let's start with consciousness itself.
Duh.
The big C. What is it?
Yeah, the easy question first.
Right. Is it like one single thing, this unified feeling of being aware? Or is it maybe more like a collection of different processes all happening at once in the brain?
Well, that's the core challenge, isn't it, defining it? Some perspectives, like the idea of witness consciousness, you see this in thinkers like Sideritz, Thompson, Zahavi. They talk about a kind of neutral inner observer.
Okay, like just...
Sort of. Imagine just being aware of your thoughts and sensations popping up without necessarily grabbing onto them or saying, that's me thinking that. It's purely observational. And importantly, it doesn't really commit you to any big metaphysical ideas about what reality is.
Right, almost like a camera lens, just focused on your experience, neutrally recording.
But then, as Al-Bahari points out, we also have this really strong feeling of a personal owner.
Ah, the me.
Exactly. That feeling of I that seems to be having the experiences. It's like that camera lens suddenly has a name, a backstory, a whole personal history attached. It draws a boundary.
Yeah, that feels very familiar.
And here's where it connects to some really interesting ideas. Certain traditions, Buddhism in particular, see that very sense of a fixed, permanent, personal owner as, well, as a kind of self-illusion, to use Al-Bahari's term.
An illusion, wow.
Yeah. Practices like meditation are partly aimed at, loosening our grip on that fixed sense of, I am this unchanging person.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if that feeling of a constant me isn't the whole story, what is truly fundamental about our awareness.
That's quite a thought.
Yeah.
Okay, so if that's consciousness, let's pivot to that first big problem.
Yeah.
The mind-body connection.
Right.
We have to start with Descartes, don't we? He famously drew a very, very clear line.
Oh, yes. Between the thinking self, the res cogitans, and the physical body, the res extensa.
And his big argument was, you can doubt pretty much anything, even your own body. Maybe you're dreaming, maybe it's an illusion.
Yeah.
But the very act of doubting proves
you exist as a thinking thing. You can't doubt that you're doubting, essentially.
So for him, they were fundamentally different kinds of substance. Mental stuff, physical stuff.
Separate.
Completely separate realms. But, even though that feels intuitive, in some ways my thoughts feel different from my elbow, it immediately raises problems.
Like, how do they interact? Exactly. If they're totally separate, how does my decision to lift my arm mental cause my arm physical to lift?
Yeah.
Or how does a stub toe physical cause pain mental? Descartes had his own ideas involving the pineal gland, but it's always been seen as a bit problematic.
Yeah, bit of a sticking point. And think about stress, a mental state having very real physical effects. It suggests the line isn't quite so sharp.
For sure. Then you have someone like Locke coming at it a bit differently. He was really focused on experience and how we learn, and he asked this really fundamental question.
Which was?
Could a purely material thing, just physical stuff, atoms, whatever, actually think? Or do you absolutely need some kind of non-physical, immaterial thinking substance attached to it?
So could matter itself have the property of thought?
Potentially. Locke was more agnostic maybe. He pointed out that our understanding of what thinking even is pretty limited. So he basically said, look, for all we know, God could have just added the power of thinking to matter. We can't really rule it out just because we don't understand how it would work. Our ignorance doesn't prove it's impossible.
That's a much less certain stance than Descartes.
Definitely. And then things get even more interesting with Aristotle.
Okay, going back further.
Yeah. As Polanski explains it, Aristotle saw the soul and body as much, much more intertwined. For him, most of what we call affections of the soul, things like thinking, sensing, feeling emotions.
They likely involve the body.
Exactly. They aren't just properties of some separate soul floating around, the properties of the whole living thing, the combination of soul and body. The soul is more like the form or the function of the living body.
Much more integrated.
Much more. However, Aristotle did carve out a potential exception for the intellect, our capacity for abstract thought.
Ah, okay. Why?
Well, he argued that because the intellect can think about anything, grasp universal forms, it can't be mixed with any particular physical thing or organ in the way sight is tied to the eye. It has to be, in some sense, separate to be able to receive all forms.
That's subtle.
It is. He also made this interesting point. Our senses can be overwhelmed. Stare at the sun, you damage your sight. Listen to a deafening noise, you hurt your hearing. But he thought, thinking about really intense, powerful ideas doesn't seem to damage our ability to think more. If anything, it might strengthen it, which again suggests to him the intellect might be different, less tied to the physical limitations.
So we've got quite the spectrum. Descartes, sharp separation. Locke, maybe matter can think. Aristotle, deeply connected, mostly, but maybe the intellect is special.
A real range. And then we jump forward again to something much more radical. Eliminative materialism.
Right. This is the idea from people like Churchland, and you sort of see hints of it in the way Sideritz, Thompson, Zahavi talk about rejecting a non-physical soul.
Yes. And the basic idea is, well, pretty startling. It suggests that our whole everyday way of talking about the mind, using terms like beliefs, desires, intentions, feelings, what philosophers sometimes call folk psychology, might just be a fundamentally flawed theory. And eventually, it could be completely eliminated and replaced by a purely neuroscientific description of brain states and processes.
So you wouldn't say, I believe it's raining. You'd describe, I don't know, firing patterns in certain neural clusters.
Something like that, yeah. The claim is that terms like belief or desire don't actually refer to anything real in the way that, say, neuron or synapse does. They might be like the old concept of phlogiston in chemistry, a placeholder that eventually got thrown out when we understood combustion better.
Wow. That is a mind-bending idea. To think our whole inner life as we experience it and talk about it might just be wrong.
It's definitely provocative. It suggests our intuitive understanding of ourselves is radically mistaken.
And where does something like artificial intelligence fit into this? Because Dreyfus was famously critical of early AI.
Right. Dreyfus raised some deep challenges. He questioned whether you could ever truly replicate human understanding, our ability to grasp context, make nuanced judgments, deal with ambiguity using purely formal rules and symbol manipulation, which was the dominant approach in AI then.
Because so much of our understanding seems intuitive, embodied, based on background knowledge.
Exactly. Things that are incredibly hard to formalize. His critique suggests that there might be aspects of human intelligence, perhaps consciousness itself, that resist a purely mechanistic or computational explanation, whether it's in a brain or a computer. It sort of pushes back against the purely materialist view in a way.
Okay, so that's a fascinating, if slightly dizzying, tour through the mind-body problem. Let's switch gears to the other big one, the problem of other minds.
Why do we assume other people have inner lives?
Yeah, it feels totally automatic, right? You see someone smile or wince in pain, or they tell you they're happy or sad.
And you just assume there's an inner experience accompanying that behavior, an experience similar to your own when you behave that way.
But if you stop and think, philosophically, what's the actual evidence? All we ever directly observe is their physical body and its movements, its sounds.
We never directly access their subjective experience, we just infer it.
This feels connected to Hume's idea of the self, the bundle theory that al-Bahari mentions.
How so?
Well, if Hume is right that even our own sense of self isn't this solid, enduring thing, but just a constantly shifting collection of perceptions, a bundle of experiences flowing by.
Like a river, not a rock.
Right. Then what basis do we really have for assuming there's a stable, unified, enduring mind or self inside someone else, if we don't even find one in ourselves when we look closely.
That's a great point. Hume's skepticism about a persistent self makes assuming one in others even more problematic. Maybe what we perceive as their mind is just our way of making sense of the patterns in their behavior, constructing a convenient narrative.
And then there's Kant. He comes into this too with the transcendental ego.
Ah, Kant always complicates things in an interesting way.
Yeah, Strawson touches on this in the context of Cartesian and Kantian thought. It's a bit abstract, this transcendental ego idea.
It is. It's not really a thing like Descartes' soul. It's more like the necessary structure or underlying unity of consciousness that has to be there for us to have any kind of coherent experience at all.
Like the operating system analogy. It's what allows all the different perceptions and thoughts to hang together as my experience.
Kind of. Kant argued that for experience to be possible for us to perceive objects in space and time and make judgments, there must be this unifying function that synthesizes all the incoming data. It's a logical requirement for experience as we know it.
But does that logical requirement within my own experience guarantee that you have a similar unifying principle, a similar inner world?
That's the leap, isn't it? Kant establishes the conditions for my possible experience, but whether that directly proves the nature of your inner experience is still debatable.
And this all leads to some really profound questions, especially when we move beyond other humans. Is our whole concept of mind just fundamentally based on our human experience?
It seems likely, doesn't it? Our language, our concepts, they're all developed from our specific way of being in the world.
So how can we ever really know what's going on, if anything, inside an animal? A dolphin, a dog, an octopus, or even looking ahead, a highly sophisticated AI.
We have run up against the limits of our own frame of reference. This is where someone like Martha Nussbaum's work becomes really relevant, thinking about justice and capabilities for non-human animals.
How does she approach it?
Instead of getting bogged down in, do they have a mind exactly like ours, which is maybe unanswerable, Nussbaum suggests focusing on what creatures are capable of doing and being, what kinds of flourishing are possible for them given their nature. This shifts the ethical focus away from demanding human-like consciousness.
That seems like a more practical way to think about ethical treatment, rather than getting stuck on proving subjective states we can't access.
Exactly. And another interesting angle comes from McKenzie's idea of enacting the self.
Okay, what's that?
The suggestion is that our sense of self, and maybe consciousness too, isn't just some pre-existing thing inside us. It actually emerges, it's performed or enacted through our dynamic interactions with the world, with our environment, and especially with other people.
So the self is something we do as much as something we are.
Kind of, yeah. It's constantly being created and recreated in dialogue with our surroundings. If you think about it that way, understanding other minds might be less about peering inside them and more about understanding their patterns of engagement, their way of enacting their self in their world.
A much more dynamic picture.
Very much so.
So looking back over this whole journey, consciousness, mind, body, other minds, were there any connections or moments that really jumped out at you as surprising or particularly insightful?
Definitely. One thing I found really striking was a potential parallel. On one hand, you have Aristotle, centuries ago, emphasizing that the activity of sense perception is complete at every single moment. Sensing isn't a process moving towards completion, it is complete presence. And then you look at modern phenomenology, the work discussed by Sideritz, Thompson, Zahavi, and their focus on the immediate presence of momentary experience, the way consciousness is always the now, the current taking place of time passing.
Ah, I see. Both highlighting the immediacy, the nowness of awareness, despite coming from totally different times and traditions.
Exactly. It's like discovering the same underlying insight through very different lenses.
That is fascinating.
And another recurring theme that's quite remarkable is how many different traditions end up questioning the idea of a fixed, solid, unchanging self.
Right, we saw that with Buddhism, Hume, maybe even hints in Kant.
Yes. Buddhism, Hume's bundle theory, phenomenology's focus on process, even some readings of Kant that emphasize the unity as a function rather than a substance. There's this persistent challenge across the board to that intuitive feeling of a permanent I sitting inside somewhere, even while fully acknowledging the reality of subjective experience itself.
It really makes you reconsider that default assumption.
It does. And these aren't just abstract philosophical games, are they?
No, not at all. Thinking about the mind-body problem. Even if we don't have the final answer, surely how we think about it impacts real-world things, like medicine, mental health.
Absolutely. If you see mind and body as deeply interconnected, that leads to very different approaches to health and illness than if you see them as totally separate. Think about psychosomatic effects, the role of mental state in healing. It has direct implications.
And the other mind's problem, too. How we think about animal consciousness or potential AI consciousness.
Directly shapes our ethical frameworks. How should we treat animals? What rights or considerations should advanced AI have? These questions hinge on our assumptions about their potential inner lives, even if we can't be certain.
So, as we start to wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
we've certainly covered a lot of ground.
We have. It's complex stuff.
We've looked at that persistent feeling we all have of being a unified self, but also the serious philosophical and neuroscientific challenges to that very idea.
The self is maybe less solid than it feels.
We've wrestled with that deep mystery. How does physical stuff, our brain, give rise to subjective experience? The whole mind-body puzzle.
Still one of the biggest unanswered questions.
And we've questioned the basis for our assumptions about other people, other beings having minds like our own.
Yeah, that automatic assumption is harder to justify than you might think.
So these clearly aren't simple questions, no easy answers here.
Not at all. But just engaging with them, thinking them through, I think it offers really profound insights into what it means to be human, our place in the world.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, take away. Considering all these different perspectives we've touched on today, from Descartes to Aristotle to neuroscience to Buddhism, how might your own understanding of your own consciousness be shifting, even slightly?
And what about your assumptions regarding the inner lives of others? Are they still sitting as comfortably as they were before?
What new questions does this exploration leave you with as you go back out and continue to experience the world around you? Something to ponder.